Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the FX DRS, and what we're going to be doing in this video is fitting the larger plenum along with the angled gauge bracket and the gauge onto the side like so. The gauge on the side here will allow us to read the current set pressure of the regulator, and that should make things nice and easy when we come to tune the rifle. Before we get into fitting it though, there are just a few things that I would like to go over. And the first one is very briefly explaining what a plenum is. So the plenum on these rifles here is the store of regulated air available to the back of the valve. This is the air that we use when we take a shot through the rifle. Having a large plenum is very beneficial for high power and FAC rifles, as the more air you have behind the valve, the higher the potential power of the rifle will be. Now with that said, just because the rifle is fitted with a large plenum does not mean that the rifle will be high power. There are a lot of limiting factors such as regulator pressure, hammer spring tension, hammer weight, all those sort of things play a part in the power of the rifle. For a sub 12 pound rifle, there is no real benefit of having a large plenum. However, for this rifle here, you cannot fit the angled gauge or the gauge bracket on the side of the standard plenum. And if I'm honest, I quite like the look of the larger plenum when it's fitted to the rifle, so that's the reason we're going to be installing it. So on this particular rifle, I'm installing the large plenum and the gauge on the side because I like the way it looks, and also I want to be able to read the regulator set pressure. With that said, we can start work on installing these two parts here, and the first thing we need to do is make sure that the rifle's safe and then degas it. To do that, all you would do is cock the rifle, remove your magazine or single shot loader, then fire the rifle into a nice safe backstop. That makes sure that there's not a pellet loaded into the barrel. Then we can start degassing the rifle. The first thing we need to do is remove the stock by flipping it up, then removing the stock bolt in the bottom here using a 4mm Allen key. With that off, we can then degas the rifle by first loosening the gauge slightly, then waiting for the rifle to bleed out. That's done by using a 22mm spanner, cracking the gauge loose, and then just gently loosening it until you start to hear the rifle hiss, at which point you just need to leave the rifle to fully degas. Once the hissing has stopped, you can remove the gauge entirely. That just makes sure there's no air trapped inside the air cylinder. Then you would dry fire the rifle into a nice safe backstop to make sure that there was no residual air left inside the plenum. Once we're happy, we can remove the old plenum by just loosening these 4 bolts in the bottom here using a 3mm Allen key. And there we have the old plenum removed. So this is a true sub 12 pound plenum, and as you can see there, it is just a block of material. There is no drillings in this piece of material, but I will make you aware that there is a small O-ring on the base of the block, just this one here, so just make sure that doesn't get lost as you remove the plenum from the rifle. With that done, the next thing we can do is get our new plenum installed. And to do this, you do get a few new screws in the bag when you buy your plenum, so it's just those ones there. The ones in the sub 12 pound plenum are quite a bit longer and they won't work with the new style of plenum. But with that said, we'll get those dropped into these 4 holes here. Then we can line these holes with the left hand side of the rifle and get the plenum put into position. Then we can just take a nice long 3mm Allen key and get those done up nice and tightly. I like to get all 4 bolts done up so that they're touching, check that there's nothing pinched between the block and the plenum, and then get all 4 bolts done up nice and tightly. The next thing we're going to do is install the angled gauge bracket and the digital gauge. Up next, because we're fitting the angled gauge bracket, we can remove this cover screw in the side of the plenum. That's done by using a 1.5mm Allen key. Beneath this grub screw there is also a small piece of plastic which I'm going to take out by flipping the plenum up, then just knocking it out the side of the rifle. The puck itself can be quite tight within the hole, but there we have it there, so I just managed to remove that by tapping the other side of the plenum. Now if I'm honest with you, the first time I installed the angled gauge bracket, I left the puck in and everything did seem to work okay, although I will say the gauge was a little slow to respond, so this time I'm taking it out. But with that said, we can get our gauge bracket installed. First thing we're going to do is make sure that O-ring there is put into position. Then we can get that screwed into the side. So there we have the gauge on the side of the rifle. What we can do next is reinstall our gauge on the side here. I'm going to put my gauge cover back on as well. Then the next thing I'm going to do is wind the hammer spring out. When we install the plenum, the power may change, so best practice is to wind the hammer spring all the way out, then readjust when we repressurize the rifle. But with that said, the next thing we can do is gas the rifle back up. We won't be able to install the action into the stock just at the moment, as the gauge on the side here does block it from entering the stock. But we can take our filler probe, get that installed, then gas the rifle back up again. Right then, so I've had a quick shoot of the rifle over the chronograph and I've got it shooting where I want to be. At the moment we're shooting around 780 feet per second using JSB 8.44 grain pellets, and I've found that to be a really nice speed for those particular pellets. Our gauge on the side is working really quite nicely, and I've got my regulator set to around 80 bar. I'll just take a shot so you can see what happens. Rifle drops down to about 77, then over a few seconds it creeps back up to around 79, 80 bar. That is a little lower than the factory set point for the regulator. On this rifle, the factory set point was around 100 bar, but with the new larger plenum, I was able to drop that slightly and still achieve the same pellet speed. But with that said, the next thing we need to do is get the action back in the stock, and unfortunately with the angled gauge bracket and the gauge on the side here installed, we can't just put it into the stock. We do need to degas the rifle, remove the bracket on the side here, install the action into the stock, then if we want to we can reinstall the gauge bracket, or we could just refit the blanking plug. Luckily to degas it, it's nice and simple. What we can do is just loosen this gauge on the side here. After a turn or two, the gauge should deseat from whatever seal you've used in the angled gauge bracket, and then you just need to leave the rifle until it fully degasses. This gauge here is reading 0, and we can spin the gauge out by hand so that there's obviously no air left inside the plenum. We're just going to go ahead and get that done up to where it was originally. Then we can take the gauge bracket off by just loosening the two securing screws using a 3mm Allen key. Again, as you take that off, just make sure the O-ring on the end here doesn't get lost. So this oval one here. The other one at the top is for a different rifle. To be honest with you, this angled gauge bracket here is from my Impact, so it's not the dedicated DRS one, but I think they're the same. With that said, at this point we could either reinstall our small plug and our capping grub screw. That would block off this hole here and stop air from leaking out of it. Or we could leave the angled gauge bracket off and reinstall it when we put the action into the stock. With the new plenum, the big one here, you don't have to have the gauge installed, you can just keep the seal intact. I'm going to put the gauge back on the side. So for now we'll just be installing the action back into the stock. Nice and carefully like so. Then we can get our stock bolt reinstalled into the bottom here and get that done up nice and tightly with a 4mm Allen key. Right then, with that done, the rifle is now ready to be gassed back up again, then taken down range and tested. What I thought we'd do to finish out the video was just go through some of the results I noticed when installing the new Plenum. So starting off with accuracy, and if I'm honest, the accuracy of the rifle didn't really change that much. I would say that the rifle was slightly nicer and easier to shoot. With the new hammer spring setting and the lower reg pressure, the rifle was a little less jumpy, and I found it easier to keep on target. Measuring the groups as compared with the old Plenum, they didn't really change that much. If you was being really critical, you could probably say that the new Plenum tightened up the groups by about 0.5 millimeter on average, so really not a big change at all. The big improvement came with the improved shot count from the rifle though. With the old Plenum and from a 200 bar fill, I was getting just under 100 shots. However, with the new Plenum, from the same 200 bar fill, I'm getting around 200 shots, so the shot count pretty much has doubled. This could be because of a number of reasons. I believe the most likely answer is because the old Plenum was just far too small. The amount of air available to the back of the valve wasn't enough, so the valve had to stay open for an excessive amount of time in order to get us the pellet speed we were looking for. That's obviously not a problem with the new Plenum as it's much larger and there's enough air to get the pellet speed that we're after nice and easily. Now, as I said earlier, I did reduce the regulator pressure very slightly from around 100 bar to 80 bar. However, with the regulator set at 100 bar, I was still getting around 170 shots from a 200 bar fill. Apart from that though, it's still the same good old DRS. To be honest with you, I really like shooting the DRS. I think it's a fantastic rifle, and in my opinion at least, it's probably the best rifle that FX has made in quite some time. I have got a fair amount planned with this rifle, and the eagle-eyed among you will have seen a few mods made to the rifle, which I'll be going over in different videos. And just in case anyone is wondering, the trigger unit I have on this particular rifle is the match trigger from the FX Crown. It does fit and it does work, however it is an absolute pain to set up and I can't get the safety to work, so the rifle is currently without a safety. To be honest with you, that doesn't bother me in the slightest, as I never trust the safety on an air rifle. The only way this rifle is ever safe is when it's decocked and unloaded. But I just thought I'd mention that, because if you're desperate for a match trigger for your rifle, the FX Crown one is available through Humor Air, and I think it's also available through Crow. The only other thing I'll mention is I did have to mill a little bit out of the trigger guard at the front here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it, but in this window here, as the trigger did hit the guard. So unless you're in a real hurry for your trigger, you may be better off waiting for the dedicated DRS trigger. But if you couldn't wait and were prepared to do a few modifications, you could fit the match trigger from the crown to the rifle itself. But that's a topic for another video. With that all said and done, guys, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and we'll see you in the next one.